In February of 2021, something happened that was never really supposed to be possible. The state of Texas, a place that most people associate with blistering heat, with deserts and cattle and endless sunshine, quite simply froze solid. The temperatures crashed to record shattering lows. Thick snow blanketed the highways. And then, catastrophically, the electrical power grid of the entire state began to fail. Millions upon millions of people were suddenly plunged into complete darkness and into a deadly, brutal, freezing cold with no heat and no light and no running water at all for days on end. And the true cause of it all was not, in fact, anything that had happened in Texas at all. It was a strange and a violent event that had quietly unfolded weeks earlier and thousands of miles away, high above the North Pole, inside a vast spinning ring of frigid air that scientists call the polar vortex. Before we go any further, if this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, take just 1 second to subscribe. A lot of folks watch these all the way to the end and simply forget to, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Alright, let's begin. So what exactly is the polar vortex? Because despite the rather dramatic way that the name so often gets thrown around on the evening news, it is not in itself a storm, and it is not the cold snap either. It is in fact a permanent and a natural feature of our entire planet's atmosphere. High above the North Pole, far higher up than where our ordinary, everyday weather actually happens, all the way up in a layer of the atmosphere known as the stratosphere, somewhere between about 15 and 30 miles over our heads, there sits a colossal, slowly spinning whirlpool of intensely bitterly cold air. You can think of it as a great invisible cyclone of frigid Arctic air, endlessly wheeling around the top of the world. It forms every single autumn as the Arctic plunges down into the long darkness of its winter, and it strengthens steadily all through the coldest months of the year. And its single most important role, in effect, is to act rather like a great spinning wall. A powerful vortex of circling wind that corrals all of that dangerously cold polar air and keeps it firmly locked up and bottled away safely in the distant far north. And here is the truly crucial thing to understand about it. When the polar vortex is strong and tight and stable, when it is spinning fast and neatly in a nice tidy circle around the pole, then it does its job absolutely beautifully. It keeps all of that frigid air corralled up in the Arctic, exactly where it belongs, and the rest of us, living down in the mid-latitudes, get to enjoy relatively normal and relatively mild winter weather. But the polar vortex does not, by any means, always stay strong. Sometimes it weakens. And when it does, a great many things can suddenly go very wrong. And I'm genuinely curious as we go, has one of these deep Arctic cold snaps ever hit where you live? Let me know down in the comments and where you're watching from. I read them all. And honestly, they often decide what I dig into next. So, what is it that actually makes the vortex weaken in the first place? Well, the single most dramatic culprit of them all is an event with a rather clunky technical-sounding name, a sudden stratospheric warming, and it is a genuinely astonishing thing to behold. Because over the course of just a few short days, high up in the stratosphere above the Arctic, the temperature can suddenly go rocketing upward, sometimes by as much as 50 degrees Celsius, which is a full 90 degrees Fahrenheit, in a matter of mere days. It is one of the single most rapid and violent temperature swings to be found anywhere in the entire atmosphere. And this sudden, dramatic blast of warming acts rather like a great wrench thrown directly into the spinning machinery of the vortex. It slows the whole thing down. It knocks it badly off balance. And that great spinning ring of cold air can begin to wobble and to stretch out of its neat circular shape and to slide right off of the pole. Or, in the very most dramatic cases of all, it can actually break apart entirely, splitting itself into two or even more separate swirling pieces, like a spinning top that finally loses its balance and staggers wildly across the table. And when that happens, when the vortex weakens and stretches and breaks down like this, then the great spinning wall that had until that moment been dutifully holding all of that frigid Arctic air locked in place, quite suddenly fails. The cold is no longer corralled. It is no longer contained. And so, great lobes and rivers of that trapped, frigid polar air come spilling out over the edges and go plunging southward, deep, deep down into the mid-latitudes, into Europe and into Asia and into North America. And this is also, incidentally, exactly where the polar vortex connects up with that other great river of wind that you may have heard about, the jet stream flowing far below it. Because as the vortex up high becomes disrupted and weakened, the jet stream down below tends to respond by buckling and becoming wavy and loopy. And a wavy, buckled jet stream, in turn, opens up great channels and pathways that allow all of that escaping Arctic cold to come pouring straight down into places that are utterly and completely unprepared to ever receive it. Quick one before we continue. If someone in your family or a friend would find this genuinely fascinating, please do send it their way. That word of mouth is honestly how a channel like this one grows. And if it's been worth your time so far, a quick like really does help the next person find it too. Now, here is something genuinely remarkable and even a little bit hopeful about this entire process. Because these sudden stratospheric warmings and the vortex breakdowns that they cause actually give us a warning. There is a delay built into the whole system, a lag of typically somewhere between 2 and 6 full weeks between the warming event happening high up in the stratosphere and the eventual arrival of the brutal, biting cold down at the surface far below. The disruption way up at the top simply takes weeks to fully filter its way down and to reshape all of the weather beneath it. Which means that when forecasters spot one of these dramatic events beginning to unfold over the Arctic, they can very often sound the alarm weeks in advance, warning that a dangerous cold outbreak is now likely on its way to somewhere down in the mid-latitudes. But that word somewhere is doing a lot of work, because here is an important catch. A weakening of the polar vortex does not, by any means, guarantee that the cold will hit any one specific place. These events happen, on average, roughly every other year up in the Arctic, and yet they certainly do not freeze Texas every other year. When the vortex breaks down and the cold spills out, exactly where that frigid air ends up landing depends on a whole host of other factors, on precisely how and where the vortex splits or stretches, on the wandering shape of the jet stream at that moment, and on other large patterns swirling around the globe. Sometimes the brutal cold plunges into North America. Sometimes it pours instead into Europe or into Asia. And sometimes it largely stays bottled up, and very little happens at all. So a disrupted vortex is really more like the loading of a weapon than the firing of it. It dramatically raises the risk of a cold outbreak somewhere, without ever telling us for certain exactly who is going to be caught in the crosshairs. And this brings us right back to Texas, because in January of 2021, this exact sequence of events began to unfold, right on cue. A sudden stratospheric warming struck, high over the Arctic. The polar vortex, duly weakened, got stretched badly out of its shape and slid down and off of the pole. And the forecasters who were carefully watching it happen knew full well what it likely meant. In fact, many of them issued warnings, more than 2 full weeks ahead of time, that a severe and dangerous cold outbreak was very probably coming to North America. The warning, in other words, was there. And it was heard. And then, in the middle of February, the cold finally arrived, and the state of Texas found itself sitting directly and squarely in its path. On the 14th of February, a frigid Arctic front came sweeping down into the state, and the temperature simply collapsed. Over the following days, Texas endured a freeze the likes of which it had not experienced in generations. In the city of Dallas, the temperature plunged all the way down to 2 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, the single coldest reading there in 72 long years. Snow and thick ice blanketed a vast state that possessed almost no equipment and almost no experience to deal with any of it, and the freeze held Texas in its grip for nearly 9 straight, unrelenting days. But the bitter cold itself, as brutal as it was actually not the real catastrophe. The true catastrophe was what that cold then went on to do to the state's electrical power grid. Because Texas, a state that had been built from top to bottom almost entirely for the heat, had simply never truly prepared its energy system to withstand an extreme, prolonged cold. And so, as the deep freeze bit down harder and harder, that entire system began to fall apart, seemingly all at once. the natural gas wellheads, and the pipelines, which supplied the essential fuel for a huge share of the state's electricity, quite literally froze solid, choking off the flow of gas at the very worst possible moment, just as the demand for heating was absolutely exploding. Ice formed thickly on the blades of wind turbines, locking them up, and equipment at power plants of nearly every single kind froze and seized and failed. And so, in the span of just a single day, the total amount of power knocked offline actually doubled, even as millions upon millions of shivering Texans cranked their heaters up as high as they would go, sending the demand for electricity soaring to record breaking levels. And what followed next was a genuinely terrifying, white-knuckle moment that very few people, even now, fully appreciate. Because as power plant after power plant dropped offline and the demand kept relentlessly surging, the entire electrical grid began to dangerously destabilize. The grid operators were forced into desperate, sweeping, rolling blackouts, deliberately cutting off the power to millions of people on purpose in a frantic attempt to save the system as a whole from collapse. And they came within minutes, quite literally, just a small handful of minutes, of a complete, uncontrolled, catastrophic failure of the entire Texas power grid. And had that actually happened, it could have taken not hours, but weeks, or possibly even months, to bring the power back online again, a scenario almost too grim and too dark to even contemplate, unfolding as it would have in the very middle of a deadly, killing freeze. As it was, even the disaster that they narrowly avoided was staggering enough. At the very peak of it, nearly 10 million people were left sitting in the cold and the dark, without any heat, without any light, and, for a great many of them, without any running water at all. As pipes burst and water treatment plants failed right across the state, more than 14 million Texans, in the end, faced some kind of water crisis. And tragically, people died. The official death toll was eventually placed at around 250 souls, a great many of them from hypothermia, freezing to death inside their own dark, unheated homes, and many others from carbon monoxide poisoning, as desperate families ran their cars and their charcoal grills and their gasoline generators indoors, simply and desperately trying to keep warm. And some independent analyses have since suggested that the true toll may in fact have been far higher still, perhaps 2 or even 3 times that official number. And the economic damage ran clear into the tens of billions of dollars, making it one of the single costliest disasters in the entire history of the state. And the deepest and the most genuinely uncomfortable lesson of the whole Texas freeze was really this. It was not, in the final analysis, a purely natural disaster at all. The cold, yes, had certainly come from nature, from that disrupted, stretched-out vortex, spinning far above the distant Arctic. But the true catastrophe itself came from a simple and a very human failure to prepare. Texas had deliberately built itself a power grid that was optimized above all for cheap electricity and for blistering hot summers. A grid that was also, quite deliberately, kept largely isolated and cut off from the rest of the country's electrical networks, and one that had been left dangerously and negligently unprotected against the cold. The warning had come, clearly, weeks ahead of time. The underlying vulnerability was very well known, and yet, when the moment finally came, the system simply was not ready for it. And Texas, it is worth remembering, was very far from being the only place ever caught out by a wandering polar vortex. These events are a genuinely global phenomenon. Back in early 2018, a dramatic vortex disruption sent a mass of frigid air pouring westward into Europe in a cold snap that the British press memorably nicknamed the Beast from the East, burying the United Kingdom and much of the continent under snow and ice and paralyzing travel for days. In early 2019, another vortex breakdown plunged the American Midwest into truly historic cold, with the city of Chicago dropping to temperatures colder in that moment than parts of Antarctica, and that very same disrupted vortex of 2021 that froze Texas also lashed out across the Atlantic, helping to bury the city of Madrid in Spain under its heaviest snowfall in decades. Again and again, the same basic story plays out, a stumble in that distant ring of Arctic wind. followed weeks later by a deep freeze somewhere down in the world below. Now, there is one more crucial piece to this entire story, and it happens to be one of the single most counterintuitive ideas in all of climate science. Because you might, very reasonably, be asking yourself right about now, in a world that is steadily warming, and one that is warming faster at the poles than almost anywhere else on Earth, why on earth are we suddenly talking about more brutal and more extreme cold? Isn't global warming supposed to be making our winters milder and gentler over time? And here is the genuinely fascinating and the hotly debated idea at the heart of it. Because some scientists argue that the very rapid warming of the Arctic, the exact same warming that is now so dramatically melting away its sea ice, may actually be disrupting the polar vortex more and more often. The theory runs roughly like this: as the Arctic warms up and loses more and more of its bright reflective ice, it begins to change the flow of energy through the atmosphere in subtle ways that can weaken and destabilize the vortex from below, making those sudden stratospheric warmings and those dramatic cold-spilling vortex breakdowns happen more frequently than they otherwise would. And if that idea is genuinely correct, then in a strange and deeply paradoxical twist, a warming planet could actually be quietly loading the dice toward more of these savage winter cold outbreaks down in the mid-latitudes. A bizarre-sounding scenario that scientists sometimes sum up with the memorable phrase, warm Arctic, cold continents. So let me end, as I always try to, with genuine honesty and with real balance. First, and importantly, that particular link, the idea that Arctic warming is now making the polar vortex break down more and more often, is a genuine and a very active scientific hypothesis, but it is very far indeed from being settled science. It is, in fact, the very same great debate that surrounds the wavy buckling jet stream, and it is every single bit as fiercely contested. Some studies do appear to find a real trend toward a more frequently disrupted vortex, but others find no clear signal at all, and the climate models themselves simply do not all agree with one another. So this genuinely remains a wide open and a deeply fascinating scientific question. Second, and quite crucially, we really should be clear about the bigger picture here. On average, winters right across the world are in fact getting warmer over time, and not colder, as the whole planet steadily heats up. So even if these individual dramatic cold outbreaks remain severe, or even if they do become somewhat more frequent, the overall long-term trajectory of the climate is still unmistakably and undeniably toward warming. These brutal freezes are dramatic, and they are deadly, but they are best understood as sharp exceptions being punched into a warming world rather than as any kind of evidence against it. And third, the polar vortex itself is a completely natural and a permanent feature of our planet's atmosphere, and these sudden stratospheric warmings have been happening, on average about every other year or so, since long before human beings ever began to change the climate at all. The vortex, in other words, is not broken, and it is not new. It is simply a powerful, and an occasionally very dangerous, part of the way that our planet's atmosphere has always worked. But the real practical lesson of the polar vortex, and of that one terrible, frozen week down in Texas, is a genuinely simple and a deeply sobering one, and it is this: that our weather is all far more deeply and intricately connected than we ever really tend to see. A single violent burst of warming taking place 15 miles up above the North Pole in the middle of January can go on to plunge an entire desert state into a deadly killing freeze a full month later. And in a world where these wild extremes of scorching heat and of bitter cold alike are now testing our aging infrastructure as never before, the places that will actually survive them are going to be the ones that finally learn to take the warnings seriously and to prepare, honestly, for a climate that no longer behaves in quite the way that we have always expected it to. So the very next time that you happen to hear a news anchor confidently blaming some brutal cold snap on the polar vortex, you will now know that they are really only telling you the very tiniest sliver of the whole story. Because the polar vortex is not some rogue, marauding storm sweeping down out of nowhere to freeze us all. It is a great, ancient, and slowly spinning ring of frigid air, one that quietly circles the very top of the world every single winter, usually keeping all of that deep. Dangerous cold safely locked away up north, but just occasionally, when it falters and wobbles and finally breaks, releasing it all southward in a sudden spilling rush. It is completely invisible to us. It sits up higher than the clouds, and higher even than the plains, right at the very edge of space itself. And very nearly all of us will go our entire lives without ever once stopping to think about it. But every so often, that distant, silent, spinning whirlpool up over the pole stumbles just slightly in its ancient dance, and a state that was built entirely for sunshine finds itself, a few short weeks later, frozen solid and sitting helpless in the dark. The Arctic, as it turns out, is never really quite as far away from us as it might seem, and whatever happens up there, at the very top of the world, has a curious and a persistent way of eventually arriving, sooner or later, right on our own doorstep.